All those gathered here today in support. Kia ora.
I call the Honourable Meka Whaitiri.
Ko hukurangi te maunga, ko waiapu te awa, ko te whānau a te uru ahi o tina toka te hapū, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi. E tū ana ki te mihi i ngā iwi o te aukainga, ko taimai e tautoko te pānui tuarua o tātou pire. Nō reira, oku raurangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Madam Speaker, it is indeed my honour to join with all previous speakers in support of the second reading of this important bill. And what I wanted to share, Madam Speaker, is it's accepted knowledge that prior to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, many hapū around the motu lived their lives undisturbed possessions to the moana, the Rohe Moana. And in Ngāti Porou, as it was in Tairāwhiti, when the treaty was signed in 1840, that existence of hapū mana continued for 25 years, to about 1865, when the Pai Mārie movement came into the East Coast and there were disruptions, and then, of course, we had the presence of the Crown. But one thing, Madam Speaker, that I'm delighted to know and be part of is that the hapū of Ngāti Porou maintained the ahika status. And so I stand in support of the second reading of this bill and acknowledging that's the legislation that's catching up with hapū reality on Ngāti Porou. And so I want to acknowledge the agreement that was entered into way back by those original leaders with the government of the day. And Madam Speaker, it's interesting that in 2004, when the original deed of agreement was reached between Ngāti Porou, or Ngā Hapū or Ngāti Porou and the Crown, we hadn't actually even started the land treaty settlements. And it's funny that here we are 18 years where Ngāti Porou's treaty settlement legislation has passed, and we are only now just getting to this one. So I want to stand in support, like I said, with all the previous speakers, and acknowledging the work that's gone on to bring this bill to the House, Madam Speaker. I want to acknowledge and join in with others to acknowledge Uncle Api Mahuika. I want to also acknowledge my predecessor, the Honourable Parakara Horomia, who was around in 2004, and I'm sure had a hand in working with Uncle Api and ensuring that the agreement came through. There was obviously acknowledgements for the Honourable Chris Finlinson and all the hard people of Ngāti Porou who did their bit to bring this bill to where it's at now, Madam Speaker. What I want to do, Madam Speaker, is really touch on the process, because it's really critical, particularly for those that submitted in terms of the gestations, the 18 or the 14 years, Madam Speaker, from when the original agreement was signed in 2004, and how the reforms of the legislation through the Foreshore and Seabed Act, and then we went into the marine and coastal area in 2011. And of course, both Ngā Hapū of Ngāti Porou and the Crown, as these legislation changes were happening from this House, had to renegotiate so that the deed of agreement fitted with the legislation at the time. And of course, in August 2017, both parties signed this new agreement. And of course, we had our first reading here in this House on the 10th of May, and then it was referred to the Māori Affairs Select Committee. And can I please acknowledge my colleague, the Chairman, Reno Tirakartni, and all the members of the Māori Affairs Select Committee for their thorough investigation of this bill. Of course, as others have said, not everybody agreed, Madam Speaker, but I am convinced that the concerns that have been raised in this House and the examination that the Select Committee provided to those concerns have been adequately addressed in this bill, Madam Speaker. And of course, submissions closed on the 22nd of June, and we had about 215 submissions, and 18 chose to appear in front of the Select Committee, both in Gisborne and in Wellington. And of course, the Māori Affairs Select Committee reported back to the House in August 2018. And I also want to put on record, Madam Speaker, that in August 2018, as a result, or as a as an arrangement in terms of the Ngāti Porou and the Crown's treaty settlement. An obligation is for the Crown to have regular meetings with Ngāti Porou. And so in August 2018 at Tinia Porou, the current Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, met with the Ngāti Porou leadership, and amongst other issues that was raised at that hui, Madam Speaker, was the fact that they wanted to see this bill proceed. So I just want to put that on record that by us standing in this House and giving it second reading, we heard the pleas from the leadership of Ngāti Porou, and I'm so glad that we are doing this today. I ideally wish it was the third reading, Madam Speaker, but you know, we've had a busy year, legislative year on this side of the House, and I know we will get the third and final reading very shortly in the new year. But Madam Speaker, it is indeed, like I said, an honour to stand here as the Member of Parliament for Ikaro Rāwhiti, of which Ngāti Porou is a significant iwi within that rohe pōtai. But there is one matter that I do want to put on the table, particularly around strengthening our hapū capability, particularly those ones at home. There is a lot of talk around climate change, Madam Speaker, and I applaud the work that the Climate Change Minister is doing in this country in terms of our international and national obligations. But, Madam Speaker, let me say that the first point of contact with rising sea levels are going to be hapū around the country. And it'll be a challenge, but it's a challenge that we should all accept in this House around communities, particularly these hapū that we're talking about, Ngāti Porou, but all the hapū around the country. The question I have is, how ready are those communities on the coastlines and seasides around our motu? And so it's an area that I'm passionate about ensuring that our communities, particularly our hapū up the coast, are prepared for the eventuality of rising sea levels, Madam Speaker. And of course, we all know Ngāti Porou has a huge erosion and flooding issue in winter, and this bill, like I said, acknowledges the agreement that the Crown has entered into with Ngā Hapū of Ngāti Porou, oiled by a $15 million contribution. And of course, I'm not going to be the one to say where that money goes, Madam Speaker, but I do hope and I pray that it will go towards empowering our hapū in the rohe, that climate change readiness is one of the priorities that the iwi see, but it's also around attracting many of our Ngāti Porou whanaunga who don't live at home to come home. And I'm seeing more and more a lot of our people wanting to come back to the Tairā whiti. And so, like I said, Madam Speaker, this piece of legislation really is an acknowledgement and reflection of the agreement that was entered many, many years ago. And like I said, I want to acknowledge all those that worked on this bill. We are almost there, and we almost will be at the third reading so that we can ensure that our coastlines, that hapū around customary fisheries, but really, Madam Speaker, let's be real, when our hapū go and fish, they don't catch a fish and say, that's a commercial fish. Or they don't get a piece of paua and say, well, that's a customary or commercial fish or paua. Madam Speaker, it's around empowering our hapūs. It's something that we had prior to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and it should be celebrated in this House because this bill is a tool to enabling hapū mana return back to the hapū. Nō reira, e te māngai te whare, tēnei te mihi ki au koutou, e te whanaunga o te haukainga tēnā tātou, o tira ngā members of the wharenei, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou katoa.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Ngā Rohe Moana o Ngā Hapū o Ngāti Porou Bill Number 2, second reading.
This bill is set down for committee stage next sitting day. Call on Government Order of the Day Number 2.
Crown Minerals